All right, so the Water Smart Farms project started after the 2020 dry season, and I think we all remember that pretty well, which was a period of 2 or 3 years where we'd essentially run down farm water resources, and the conversation was, what happens if it doesn't rain in 2021? And we went through all the opportunities that we had to deal with what consequences might develop if we had actually got to a third dry season in a row, which is pretty much unknown. 1969 was a very dry year. There's been others, but we've never seen them in consecutive years. And we realised that we were going to have major consequences across the whole of agriculture if that happened. And largely that was a couple of things, but a big underinvestment in probably looking at the future of water supplies and developing new technologies. Some of it was around changing agronomy. We'd probably got rid of half the sheep. We'd double the area of cropping. A lot of the traditional water supplies just didn't run water anymore for all sorts of reasons. So the partnership that we set up is with 3 universities, 4 agencies, and 12, and through the Grower Group Alliance, a set of grower groups. And we categorised it into 3 projects. New models of developing water supplies. So what is different? What's an opportunity? What's in the technology space? Making dams work again, which is really this project run through the Grower Group, and I've got some brochures sitting in that space, and this is not going to focus on that talk, but Bonnie at the back there can talk to you about that through the morning. We've got 31 desalination plants that are out in the wheat belt that we're evaluating. There's the 12 grower-led farm water demonstrations. We've put 3 RO plants into communities. We've got a range of demonstrations and R&D projects, which are all those pins spread across the wheat belt. So why? More dry seasons. We've got a lot of excess water in the landscape, and I'll explain why that sounds silly when you think about the drying environment. And as you can see in the other dot points, there's a whole lot of demands on water. A great increase from agriculture for increased quality, and particularly in spraying and animals, there's an acknowledgement that we've actually probably been giving animals substandard water for some years. The opportunity exists to give them better quality water. We know technology and spray technology works much better. We can use less chemicals if we give it the right water supply. Add on to that conversation. I'm just going to focus on these 2 pieces. Why do we have excess water and how do we access it? And if we do have lots of water and it's not the quality that we want, then how do we actually make it the quality that we want? So across the wheat belt over 40 years, and it's probably been 20 years since I've stood in this venue here talking to groups of farmers about salinity back in the day, we set up a monitoring system across the wheat belt where we looked at groundwater. And we looked at groundwater not because we were thinking about it as a resource at the time. We looked at groundwater because we knew it was actually the cause of salinity, and salinity was developing. But down the road at Mayunup, we had a monitoring system. I think the Horse and Pony Club there, which was just being set up, had lost a dam because it had gone salty, and a big patch of salt developed on the bitumen road. And there were a lot of reasons to look at excess water in this landscape. But the interesting story here is that there's as much water goes into the wheat belt in round numbers as gets used by Perth and the irrigation industry on the coast across 15 million hectares. So we've got a bone dry top 2 metres, and it's soaking wet for the next 50 to 100 metres underneath it. So what is it that we can do to access that water and make it a resource? That's the simplicity. We've also been left a legacy of tools, and what the project tries to do is bring in all those industry and mining tools and put it in the context of agriculture and milk that data and resource that we own as a state to try and teach us how to see this great big geological system that sits under us as a resource. So the top map is a map of the magnetic susceptibility, which is the rock types that sit under the wheat belt. And the bottom map is a map of the soils of the wheat belt. And they come from the mining and industries, and they're acquired across the whole of the landscape, across all of the wheat belt, all of the southwest, at varying scales, but they sit in databases in state departments and they're not accessible. So one of the first things we did is one of our staff members grabbed all that data and we put it in an app. So you can access it, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So soils, geology, and we teamed up with Curtin University and the Department of Mines to look at how do you find water under the ground in the wheat belt, in the rock. So that project started a couple of years ago, and our goal was to look at where in the wheat belt, under what geological conditions, can we find water in places where water has not been found in the past. Because the wheat belt is generally made up of 20-30 metres of heavy clays, which are often brackish, that don't yield much water. And there will be examples, and there are plenty of examples, where you do find small amounts of water, but the problem with the clay nature of the soils is that you don't yield enough to generate enough for a production system that most farmers need. But we know for hundreds of metres under that clay soil are rocks that have been cracking and fracturing and moving, earthquakes a couple of years ago down, south towards Rocky Gully, through the wheat belt, through Arthur River. In recent years, people have got cracks in their houses. Meckering, 50 years ago, whatever it was celebrated just recently. So this landscape has been moving and cracking, and the opportunity exists to find water. So this is Kojonup as a particular example. This is the fabric of the geology map that sits under the landscape across the wheat belt. There are faults, which are these blue lines. There are dikes, which are these red lines. And we went to this location because it was geologically interesting. And our step process to find water is we find a piece of geology that looks interesting. I won't get into the detail. Then we go out on site with a couple of guys with a couple of tools on their back, and thankfully Curtin are doing that for us. And we look at a very small area of a part of a paddock and do a separate survey, which I'm not going to get into the technology, and then look for the opportunity where those cracks are likely to be the highest, if you like, the highest frequency of cracks and features with the most probability of finding water. So how have we gone last summer? Because this project's just finished. So we've drilled a project of 17 sites between Merredin and Manjimup across a section of the wheat belt, drilling to 70 to 120 metres. We've had 10 successful, 5 at over 3 litres a second and some higher, and all of these are with salinity within the stock category, but many of them at salinities which are probably above what you would want for ewes, cattle, and it's in that window of just over what you need, particularly for higher value uses. So in this particular example that I just showed you at Kojonup, west of Kojonup, this is the rig parked just before we were finished that hole. It's currently down at about, I think it was about 80 metres when this little film was taken, and that's just getting into the fracture system, and that's producing around about 300,000 litres a day. So we haven't tested this hole yet. It's likely that the sustainable yield will be about half that. But anyway, that's getting to too much detail. So if you've got water, you then have options. Even if the quality is not optimal, then you look at managing the quality. So I'm going to flip from the supply side to the quality side. This is a really quick run through. So this is an example of a technology, and we're going to hear about this from Michael in a minute, where in about 2019, 2020, as that set of dry seasons developed, farmers across the wheat belt started to experiment with desalination. So we teamed up with Murdoch University to give us the capacity to engage in the technology discussions, and we have a couple of separate projects running in this space. One is an inventory of 30 plus desalination units all running off groundwater, particularly out in the lower rainfall areas east of here, to understand why the technology works or doesn't, what the improvements could be and opportunities to actually make these systems more efficient, and also to do things like find out what we need to do with the rejected water and where the cost efficiencies come and where the value lies. So where do you make money to pay the bill, which is kind of the question at the back of the room a minute ago. To pay the bill to adopt the technology, you've got to make the money in the first instance. So that's that inventory and analysis piece, and with the link that I think Peter sent out, there was a case study of these two guys in the ABC website about how they develop opportunities. Kristen has a feedlot, and he's moved a lot of animals into a feedlot circumstance to around developing the profit from the product, from the water, whereas the Sewell's business is developing the profitability from the spray technology and the reduced costs and the management of hard to control weeds, because of the fact that they're using scheme water with a very high pH and other issues that they can't buffer, whereas desal water has a low pH and a high effectiveness against some of the weeds that are notorious to control. So Tom mentioned this example, and I thought I'd just spend a minute on it. This is the example of the salt patch that Tom mentioned. It was a 20 hectare area of salt around some tree plantings that had been established 20 years ago, which had effectively covered up the 20-year-old salt patch, but hadn't done anything to deal with the growth, the 5 hectare salt patch, but hadn't done anything to stop the 20 hectares that had since developed around the outside of that. The white lines are a bit of geology, which is context. The RO plant sitting in this shed, he's gone through 2 phases of the development of this plant, and currently that RO plant is running on 120,000 litres a day of input, producing 60,000 litres, 60 kilolitres of low salinity water, and rejecting 60,000 litres of higher salinity water. But note that the water supply was good. I mean, you'd put that in animals under most circumstances, but they wanted this for spray technology, so they needed low salinity water, and the rejected water was at about 6,000 milligrams per litre, and the creeks in this area run at anything between that and 30,000 milligrams per litre, so just for context. Tom showed you the picture of the lupin crop growing on that scald. Because it had been, the water tables have been reduced, there's no scald. So that's a byproduct, but Robert, in his conversations online, will tell you, and there are podcasts that we've got with Robert talking about this, that he, over 2 years, and I think he might have got up to about $200,000 plus in his investment, he runs 12 or 14,000 hectares of crop. I think that's the business. And they basically have turned off their entire Water Corp network, and they use that RO unit to supply all their crop water. 60,000 litres a day on their spray programs, and he believes he's paid it back. In setting up this RO demonstration project, we're not RO salespeople, we're R&D assessors, auditors, if you think of us more like that. So the problem with working in a climate that we have is 1 year it's dry and these RO systems are going flat out, and the next it's rained and everyone's turned them off. So we went into partnership with 3 towns and a school to demonstrate these things running over a longer cycle. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But these are the saline end of the marketplace where these RO systems are running. So half seawater, if you think of it in those sorts of terms. Small yields for 10,000 litres a day to high yields at 70,000 litres a day, depending on the system. All right, so I'm just going to stop on one unit before I talk about a summary of costs and then an overview slide. So, like all the technology, sits in headers and cropping gear and all sorts of technology at the moment, these units come with remote monitoring and reporting systems, so you can have mobile phone coverage to your RO unit, tells you it's operating, tells you when it's off, tells you when it needs a clean, and a maintenance schedule. This system that we put at Wongatha is an Indigenous agricultural training school, and for many years the kids have had difficulty getting water supplies just for some of the functional aspects of the school, but they couldn't run their horticulture program and they couldn't run their ag cropping program because they didn't have water. So they would borrow water from a neighbour and it got pretty messy. So through a cross-funded project, we put this unit into the school as a demo. So it's currently produced in, I think we must be up to about 6 to 8 months now. It's produced 3.3 million litres of water. It's currently running at salinities, as you can see there. And this one is probably one of the highest spec units that we've got out there. So this runs an 18-hour a day service, and it's fully autonomous and currently off-grid. So it runs with 120 solar panels, some backup in terms of power, and this is a $250,000 system. So this is not what a farmer would use on a regular farm system, but this is an up-spec system, just so you know that the top end of the market is more at the, not the Land Cruiser, it's sort of in that middle range investment category. But so far so good, and this has turned around that community and that school. All right, let's just go through a couple of slides to finish. So if we look at the costs of this, and cost is absolutely a consideration. Cost of these units are running at around about $30,000 for an entry point, up to about $100,000 for the base unit that sat in that school, all right? Just that RO unit in that container. The variable costs, depending on your water quality, are issues with water quality itself, so getting iron under control, magnesium under control, silica under control. There are kind of steps in this process. Membranes. The membranes here in this farm unit, this is one just to the east of Kojana. We're just sitting at the back there. You can just see them behind the box. They have got to be traded out on about a 1 to 4 year ratio, depending on how well you maintain the unit. Solar comes in at about 30 as an add-on for a unit like this, to 150, which is the unit at the school. So you can do the maths. You can get into this at 30,000, you can upscale to 60,000, you can go up to $250,000, but just get your head around numbers. And then post-RO, we won't get into that. And I've excluded the drilling and the water supply and their costs. So what are the issues? The fascinating thing about the international literature in RO is that almost nobody across the world has done what we're doing by adaptation and adoption of small units. I thought we were doing something pretty interesting, but the world scan of the RO systems is nobody's doing what WA is doing and what WA farmers have done in the last 3 years. And why is it different? Because nobody wants to turn them off. Nobody wants to use them intermittently in that sense. Nobody's using them in an ag context at a farm business scale, very rarely. They're all big corporate water corporation scaled machines that are like binning up, that are like the new plant that's going in at Alkimos, they're corporate. And apart from Spain and a bit of Brazil, there's a bit of Brazil that's doing some agricultural work at farm scale, but again, they're government, they're not farm. So that's really interesting. The other really interesting thing we're finding about the units is that water quality, we thought water quality would be a major constraint on adoption. It's not. It works out that the cost of running a plant like the Sewell plant and the cost of running one of these saline plants is actually not that much difference. So there's a whole lot of things that I can't get into now. But the future is small solar running full-time. So rather than have a big unit running part-time, you have the unit that you need running most of the time. And the ability to run standalone power and standalone water is getting very close. So if you think about it from a farm perspective, that gives you water security. If you think about it from a state perspective, that means that power lines that cost billions, steel pipes that cost billions, are no longer necessary to run sheep. They're important to run communities and to run towns. And in fact, Boyup Shire, I think there's an example at Tone Bridge of about a small community that's going through these maths at the moment, and I'm giving them a bit of a hand in the background. All right, so the topic that always comes up is what about the salty water? And it's a good question. So along the parallel lines of all these demos and sites that we're looking at is what do you do and what are farmers doing and what impact is it having from the water that you don't take out of the desal plant. So there's a couple of things that you can do at the desal plant. The first one is we don't need 100 or 200 milligrams per litre water unless you're spraying. For most farmers who are using livestock, they could actually put water back through the system and take some and actually produce a fit for purpose salinity product. But let's say we're going with the RO plant as is. Reject bores are currently a really good opportunity. So we're taking the water, in fact, this one, you probably can't see it, but back in about 300 metres in the back of that photo, and that's a canola crop, is the production bore. And if you like, 100% of water for the plant is coming out of that. And the 50% that is wasted, rejected at the moment, remember this stuff will have a value as well in the future, but not today, is going back down another bore. So we've taken one part of water out of the aquifer and we're putting a half part or 2 to 1 back in. So the net effect is the water table's lower and we've created space for the reject water to go back, but it's going back slightly more saline. There are a lot of evaporation basins out there, either constructed or as on-farm salt lakes. There are saline dams that are used to hold the reject water. There are a lot of existing drains that are being used to take the water. In the Geraldton area, where the irrigators are using these things, because Geraldton's water is quite saline, they're actually desalinating scheme water, and that's a banana crop being used to take the reject water. So you can use another crop to use the water. And probably the best example for us in our landscapes is saltbush. You can get 10 times the yield out of saltbush by irrigating it. So that's probably a go-to, but we have very little experimental data for that. And that Wongatha school site is where we're demonstrating that and that system. And in this area, from a farm business, and I don't want to use the word an ecological option because I'm probably being a little bit intemperate with the language. But we're going back to sites where we've put in siphons because you don't always have to pump water, it'll come out of the ground on its own. And this is an example of a siphon that's been running now 25 years and flowing at about 50,000 litres a day. That was a bare scold over around about 1 to 2 hectares. That site has now rootus, sedges, grasses and shrubs over about that 1 to 2 hectares rather than a scold, because the vegetation's come into that water-rich environment, so is parts of the old ecological system. This is an altered system, but not all discharge is bad discharge. So it's not saying that you should, but that's the way you get rid of water at the moment. Products and values that are in the salt market, in the specialty markets, are immature at best at the moment. All right, so I just want to finish off with a conversation around what have we got for you. Water Smart Farms is the project, and you can go on that website, and that gives you access to all these demonstration sites. If you want to know what the water table salinity is like near your place and where the bores are so you can get a sense of what you've got, then that's the Groundwater and Salinity app. HydroGuide, what we're doing in this space is we have AI systems that have mapped every dam in the wheat belt, and that's a couple of years old. And all the flow characteristics of the topography, so you can use for trying to understand where water will go. That's on the website. The geology tool that I just showed you, which is an indicator of how you might go about looking for water. And then I didn't actually, I think I might have gone over the slide, but we also manage the regulatory proponency process about how you manage and get rid of that rejected water. And so far, through that process, we've got about 90% compliance, and pretty much everyone has delivered the environmental outputs that are required to justify that to the Commissioner. All right, let's just finish with one summary slide. So it's very hard to see this slide, but I want to take you back to 1994. So we're sitting in the sheds. There's the road that you came in from Boyack Brook, Westbourne Road's just to the south of us. We're sitting in the sheds just there. And we've got a bore just out in the paddock there, and I was just saying that bore still exists, which I thought it would have been bulldozed 20 years ago. And we started monitoring back in '94, and I think you can see we stopped in about 2000. And that's the depth of water table in that bore. That bore went to 17 metres. It makes about 10,000 litres a day, and it's about 5,000 parts per million. And I didn't know it back then, but the reason we got that yield is we drilled into the edge of a dolerite dike and just got some fractures just at the top of the dolerite. So looking retrospectively back 20 years, the model for that water supply existed on this farm, in this paddock, and we've just reapplied that knowledge. Thank you.
Right, thank you.